All right. Well, as we begin, we're in chapter 5, session 5 of Loving the Stranger. Last week, thank you, Hannah. She taught on the mission of marriage for us. Does anybody have any questions or anything from chapter 4 before we dig in? I know Hannah did a great job. There shouldn't be any questions, but if anybody's got any, we're more than welcome to answer those. Wonderful. That's good. All right. Well, as session 5 begins with Loving the Stranger, I thought this was a unique chapter myself, mainly because it kind of builds on what Keller had said at the very beginning of the book, that we never marry the right person, and we never understand who it is that we marry, or there's a day when we say, this is not the person that I married. And he really builds on that point of what is the stranger in that role there in marriage. And he goes specifically again to Ephesians 5, and it says, Jesus gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, an action that has taken place to purify another, or to put the action of love together. So when we look at loving the stranger, I do love that he brings and starts out again with this quote from Stanley Hauerwas that says on page 147 of my book, "We never know whom we marry. We just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person, just give it a while and he or she will change. For marriage, being the enormous thing it is, means we are not the same person after we have entered it. The primary problem is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married." Learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. This is part of the most difficult characteristics of Christian marriage that I think is not often spoken about enough, and really can be seen in a magnified way in our relationships, but it's something that is unique to the Christian faith in general, right? Of loving the stranger, loving our neighbor, and learning how to love them. We have to learn to do so, right? When we understand as believers in Jesus that we have to love someone whom that is not an emotional connection, that's just our action to do so, there's some learning that has to take place in that, in the way that we love other people. Part of that is when you think about the way that we love our neighbor, sometimes we do that in the way of missions, right? And we have to learn about a culture. I'll never forget, I was going to Romania my senior year of college, and we went to Bucharest for about a week and a half and spent time ministering in Bucharest and in the surrounding villages. And this was around the time of the Paris airport bombing and some other things. Romania was even on a do not fly list. But the college had put us through a series of trainings, what to do if you get caught and all these types of things. It wasn't like we were going in covert ops, but it was just, if you go in and somebody gives you problems, what's the way to get out of it, or what do you do? And I was like, Liam Neeson, kind of taught us that. I mean, you just kick butt and take names. But that wasn't how they wanted us to do it as Christians. And but the other side of things is we had to learn some of the basic greetings and things in the Romanian language. We had to learn certain parts of their culture and why that was important. And even more so because it was just general class for all of us that were going on mission for those couple of weeks, of the differences in cultures, of a hot culture and a cold culture. For example, I grew up in North Alabama, and as my parents came in this weekend, they realized it was hotter down here than up there, which is normal. But growing up, we always were under the understanding that folks from the north were just rude, that New Yorkers don't have sweet tea and gravy biscuit, and that's what made them sad. But that's not necessarily the case, right? When we think about cold cultures. We had a professor who was actually from New York, and I thought he was the meanest man in the world, Dr. Wilson. He was a Hebrew professor, Old Testament professor, so he was already kind of boring. But he was just one of those guys that you just couldn't stand. He was one of those that was hard, and he never seemed to be friendly. You weren't real sure if he liked you. But he ended up being one of the sweetest and wisest men I ever met. But because of where he's from, in that cold weather culture, you don't spend a lot of time out in the cold. Your conversations are abrupt, they're to the point. They're honest, they're true, they're genuine. You say what you mean and you go on about it. Where in the South, we say bless your heart. If you're late, you're late. If you are taking your time and the party starts when everybody gets there, you don't start Thanksgiving dinner until everybody arrives. Doesn't matter if you say it's 6, if it's 6:15, that's just what you do. But the reason it was important to learn those things was because we were going with the intention to spread the gospel. And to do that, we didn't want to be offensive. We didn't want to go in and just offend folks generally from a misunderstanding of their culture. We had to learn to love the stranger. And part of that in marriage is understanding that that is a part of what we are called to do in our marriages, which makes it a little more challenging. Because, as we look at point 1 there, we often find ourselves in the thrill of the party. And he uses the example of a masquerade party where everyone puts a mask on and pretends to be someone, and you enjoy that time together, and it's a Cinderella-like moment where you just enjoy the party. You're having a great time with everyone, and you just fall in love, and then all of a sudden, when you get back to the world, you realize that you weren't dancing with a princess. They were really a barmaid, and they don't have a glass shoe. Some crazy person in a pumpkin and a wand just gave a little dap and changed them. But then you realize, what is this life? What decision have I made? And so sometimes we often realize that marriage is not the fantasy that we had created, because our hopes and dreams for marriage often become like those Cinderella moments, where we have these dreams of what we think marriage should be, or what we think these relationships should be in our life. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in a moment where our expectation is perfection and adventure, but that's something that is almost, in a way, an infatuated fantasy. It's not real. It's not realistic. It's not something that that is tangible for us really to understand, and we get caught up in the thrill of the party, and when the mask comes off, the real work of marriage begins, and where loving the stranger really takes place, because the real depth of marriage is when the mask comes off. And I think part of that is understanding. I always tell couples this when I do premarital counseling with them. Before we begin, I was like, hey, you just need to know the person that you're sitting with here, one of you is going to leave the toothpaste tube open, and it's going to dry out, and it's going to be fine the first few weeks. But the one morning you're running late for work and need toothpaste, and you can't find it, or it's empty because, good Lord knows, they squeeze the toothpaste tube from the front instead of the back, and you get mad because you realize who this person is. Or you go to hop in the car, and it's out of gas. They were going to get it on the way to work in the morning, and they didn't realize that you had to drive to another city or whatever that day, and it's out of gas. And now you're already running late because that's just who they are. They don't care about putting gas in the car. Or whatever it may be. You realize something about your spouse that you didn't know, and things that your spouse often doesn't think is concerning. You realize they have an anger, a short temper that isn't necessarily flattering, something that you may have thought was just when they watched ball games, or just when they coached, or just when they competed when you were dating in high school or college, and you realize, like, this is how they feel about everything, even when the skillet lands on the floor, or when food falls off the plate, and that's a problem. It's a problem because those things are magnified and intensified in marriage. Because marriage itself does not create weaknesses as we often think, but it reveals it. Because we often assume that the things that are problems in our marriages that didn't exist in the dating stage or in those stages where we were getting to know one another, that all of a sudden marriage has created this in me. And it's not absolutely true in that way. It reveals these loopholes and weaknesses within us. Because what it does is in our normal relationships, for example, someone who is a very narcissistic person that has a small group of friends or co-workers around them, they may be annoying to them. They may be hard to get along with. But they just say, hey, that's Matt. That's just who he is. He's fine. He's cool. It's whatever. But when you're in marriage and you're there with that person 24/7, and you wake up to that person and you go to sleep next to that person, and the decisions about the finances of the home are with that person, and the only thing they consider is themselves, all of a sudden those personality traits are intensified and magnified. The same with addictive personalities. Some of the other things that I talk about a lot with premarital counseling in couples is, especially with those that I don't know, that I'm really trying to get to know, is to find out if divorce has been present in their families. Because studies show that children of divorced parents are more likely to get divorced in their own marriages, because it's the behavior that they've seen. It's what they know to be true and how they deal with their problems. And some folks don't want to hear, well, I'm not going to be like my parents. Well, the data shows that just like someone whose parents have been imprisoned the percentage of those that have imprisoned parents are significantly higher for the children to also become imprisoned, because it's the behavior that's been reciprocated to us. But we don't begin to see a lot of those traits until we become married to someone, because we think everybody is just blissful and wonderful, and no person that we're madly in love with has stinky poop. And all of a sudden we get to know one another in marriage and we realize they're human. These things are often exposed. If they're possessive, if they're a perfectionist, if they're lazy, if they find themselves as a workaholic or someone with an addictive personality, if they're a pessimist, whatever it may be, it will be revealed in marriage as a true character flaw and weakness, which means two things. One is something that we as the other spouse have to address. The other is just something that if we're that person and we realize that we've got a problem that we didn't think was a problem, then we have to find a way to address it. Remember from the first week, we got to find a way to treat ourselves, to deal with us, those I statements, to figure out who we are and what we have to do. It often reminds me of those old sayings from a long time ago. I think they're still true today, I'm sure. But, when you get married, a lot of times, especially strong, independent wives or soon-to-be wives will say, "Now, I'm not your mama. You've got to learn to do your own laundry, and I'm not packing your lunch every day. I've got a job too." But a lot of times that's the assumption of the man, that we're coming into here and, hey, they're going to iron my clothes, they're going to cook my food, they're going to do all these things for me. And when in reality that doesn't always seem to happen. Sometimes it does, but the way that culture has shifted, most homes, both husband and wife work, and sometimes the wife works just as long or more of hours than the husband. Those things of old aren't necessarily the same today, especially in the world where a lot of people have multiple jobs, full-time jobs. I mean, jobs that have 401ks and great salaries. A lot of folks have side hustles and things to make ends meet. So a lot of times we find these old adages to not necessarily be wrong, but not fully true. Because what we do is we put ourselves in a position to say, well, I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to be this, or you are lazy, you never do anything around the house, or you're a perfectionist, no one ever can please you. And all of a sudden we have to find ourselves to say, is what they're saying true? How do I deal with that? And how do I communicate to my spouse these parts of themselves that are concerning to me? Especially if you're talking about children and those things as well. And sometimes these things you don't see until you have time without kids, or whatever that may be. A season in life's change, or when you retire and you're at home all the time. I always find it funny when a lot of times folks will retire and they say, their spouse will say, "I don't know what I'm going to do when they're home all day. I can only handle them in little increments." It's like, you've been together for 50-something years, How did you not know that they were this way? Well, they've always worked 60 hours a week, But you get to learn one another, right? And sometimes you relearn over the years. But in marriage, it is the most truest statement to know that sometimes we see the worst of ourselves and our spouses, and we find ourselves really feeling like we have married a stranger. And this can't be the same person from that party. It reveals those deep secrets of our spouse and ourselves, which means that work must be done. So it means that we must love as Jesus loved. Right? This has been a statement that through this book has been consistent from page 1. Right? When we say, what do I do? I don't know what to do to love my spouse. Well, we begin loving like Jesus has loved, which means we must see our spouse worthy as someone worthy of the love despite their shortcomings. Because we all have shortcomings, we all have failures. But right off the bat, it means that when we say, hey, my spouse is someone who is a perfectionist, or they're lazy, or they drink a lot more at home than they thought that they did, or their language is something that is of a concern to me, or they never do anything, or whatever it may be, that is a concern, that's a true character flaw and a point of weakness. How do we communicate that? Is it to just say that I'm going to cease to love you, and to say that I'm just going to pull the plug on this relationship and just say, you're not who I thought you were, and unless you change it on your own, I'm walking out, right? You've got 2 months, or whatever it may be. And you walk out. That's not necessarily what is really in the depths of marriage and love and relationships. When you think of years and generations in marriage. But what do? When we see someone is worthy of love despite their shortcomings, then we begin to see that there's work that we can do together. That we can love them for who they are, and we can also help them, as we'll see in just a moment, to become that someone better that we are often looking for. When we do this, though, it doesn't mean that we condone their sins, right? It doesn't mean, like, let's just say, for example, our spouse drinks more than we had anticipated. I had a friend of mine, an older friend of mine, who loved a glass of wine, loved to have a glass of whiskey every now and then, and never realized it was a problem until his wife died. And when his wife died, of course, he began to do a little more, but he didn't realize when he had all this time alone, he retired as well, that it had become a real problem. And in his late 50s and 60s, had gone into rehab. And was a successful person in life and had all the things in the world. But a lot of these things we don't realize about ourselves. Well, when we fall in love with our spouse and everything's great and wonderful, and we think, hey, they're just they just flirt a little bit with other people, and it's okay. They're just real friendly. And then you realize that they're constantly on their phone talking to other people, whatever that may be, that may not be nefarious in that way. What do? Right? We condone that to say, that's okay, I still love you. Or do we say, I love you as Christ has loved you, but this is a problem. This is something that we've got to fix. This is something that we're in this together for. Because when we do that, we look to aid one another in our spiritual growth and development. We love and want to really see the true and best for our spouse and ourselves. That we can look and say, this is something that we need to work on together. Oftentimes, I like sports, and so when you look at marriage as a team, oftentimes there are things where each spouse has a different role or position on the team, right? Sometimes those change. When it comes involved to picking out baby clothes, Mary Evelyn's the quarterback, okay? I do whatever she says. She's the quarterback, she's the coach, she's the GM, whatever she wants to do, which is most of the time anyways, but especially when it comes to baby clothes and things like that. That's all her. But when it comes to working on a lawnmower, and it comes to fixing pipes and those types of things, listen, I've paid Goolsby a lot of money to be trained as an apprentice by watching them work around my house. I've learned how to do it, right? So I take the quarterback there. Like, this is what we got to do. We got to take care of these things. Mary Evelyn still acts as the GM, so got to run past her anyways. But in marriage, we all find ways that we have a role on the team. But sometimes there's conflict on the team, right? Sometimes there's, well, you didn't do a good job with this, or it's not completed, or whatever it may be. And so all of a sudden, how do you resolve that conflict? Well, if you take a look at, let's take a look at the Carolina Panthers, NFL team, all right? They've only had a few head coaches. They had Ron Rivera was one of their first head coaches. And their owner had sold the team. They got a new owner in. Hedge fund manager should do a great job with finances and things. But not only has he had almost 3 head coaches under his tenure in a short period, he can't keep a quarterback, can't develop a system or a program, anything along those lines. And the Panthers have only been in existence since the late 90s, I think. The Pittsburgh Steelers, I think, have only had 4 coaches. And they've existed since the 60s, if not before. 4 head coaches. There's a difference in the way that leadership has taken place. There's time that's allowed for transition and change and growth. Even Mike Tomlin, who has had a pitiful year, the past couple of years, is having a chance as the head coach to revamp, to redeem himself. They don't want to give up on the system and the process and the people that they've invested in. And so when we understand marriage and the way we work as a team, there are ways that we can look and say that everyone else is the problem. And when we come at it with that attitude, we look like the Carolina Panthers. We have head coaches that we can't keep. We can't keep owners. We can't keep players. We can't keep the cap costs down. We have problem after problem, and no matter how many first-round picks we get, we can't develop a good team. Or we can look at the Steelers or Bill Belichick and the Patriots over the past 25 years or so and see how success has taken place when investment is made and valued on your players and your people. And the same in marriage, where we can say that the way we resolve conflict is within ourselves and together through the love of Christ. And we look to develop ourselves and develop our spouses so that we can get better together and we can grow together in those ways. And again, to do that, we must fight the urge to not give up on our spouse and on ourselves. Because so often that is the initial urge, is to give up. to say this is just, with everything else I've got going on, this is a lot of work. Or, our kids would do better if we were separated. Or, maybe you just need to go and find yourself and then come back. Or whatever it may be. We often get to that point to where it's just easier just to wave the white flag. But that's not healthy. It's not whole. That's not what Christ has called us to do. Now, again, Scripture's been clear. There are times when divorce and those things are permissible. But again, there's a pain that takes place in that, and we don't often want to go there first or even last. It's almost as the last resort, beyond the last. So when we seek to love as Jesus has loved, the biggest thing is we fight the urge to give up, and we continue to invest in the way that we see our spouse as someone worthy of love. But oftentimes, when we see, as he says, the dross instead of the gold, is to assume that there is someone or something better that's out there. And that's oftentimes what we look for, right? When you do a study on a lot of those that have had affairs and things of that nature, 90% of the time it's someone that everyone in the family knows. It's a coworker or a friend, and it's often begun in some type of relationship that began as a friendship that just develops through the sharing of conflicts or whatever at home, and these things just begin to develop. But other times too, it's seeing that as Luke Combs said in a song, those that say the grass is greener has never seen the other side. Oftentimes it's our assumption that the grass is greener on that side until we get over there and we realize, maybe not. Maybe that's not as green as we thought it was. And so we find ourselves looking for something or someone better. And the problem is that we find ourselves in a place of constant discontentment. Because when we look at Paul's letters to the church at Philippi, he has a famous verse in chapter 4, verse 13. Right? He says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Now, I thought that was the best way for me to get my bench max up above 225 in high school. But then I went to school and realized that, that's not what Paul was talking about. He's not talking about benching Buicks and giving Tim Tebow supernatural power. But instead, it is Paul going through a very serious time of suffering and pain and trial. And he's learned that in this, the secret to happiness is to be content. And that through Christ he can do all these things and live and have faith and hope and love. Because that is the secret to happiness, is contentment. That's the secret to faithfulness, is to be able to be content in who we are in Christ, but also to be content in what we have in life. Because when you look at the commandments, do not worship any other God, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not covet. All of these things are actions that are seemingly a gain for ourselves. Why would we worship another God? Because we believe somehow, some way, that there is another God worth worshiping, something better than one we have. Why would we murder? Because we would think that the loss of life of another is greater than whatever it would take to resolve a conflict here. And murder and war are not the same thing, and self-defense are not the same thing. Why will we commit adultery? Is it just because we hate our spouse? No, it's often because we think the grass is greener. There's something better that is out there other than what we have. The same with stealing and coveting and these things. When we find ourselves in a place of contentment, it's not that we accept mediocrity or just accept passivity, but it is that we are content and happy with what we have, and we invest into those things. We pour ourselves into those things. So that we can become better. And so what Keller brings out is that when we come to that place of wanting or seeing someone or something better, then he says you're absolutely right. But the problem is it's not in something other than your spouse. That someone better is someone that your spouse can become or that you can become. And that's where that hard work of marriage takes place, to where love, as he says, marriage has the power of truth and the power of love. Right? But the power of truth is that we can acknowledge that we have weaknesses, that our spouse has weaknesses, and we can acknowledge that there are problems and that there are truthful things to this. But in doing so, we also realize that the truth is that our spouse can be better, or that they can become better. For an example that may be more close to home for us, anybody remember the Kirk Cameron movie Fireproof? Remember that movie? It's a really good movie. In there, it goes through all these things that Kirk Cameron's trying to do. His dad gives him this book on how to fireproof your marriage, and he goes through step by step of what to do to try and gain his spouse's love back and all. And of course, she's just fed up with it. It just takes like the whole time to get through this. And at the end, he's ready to give up. Like he's ready to just throw in the towel. And he's standing outside a campsite or something, and his dad's there. And he picks it up and he said, do you know where I found this? And his dad, he's like, well, no, of course, you wrote it for Mom. He's like, no, your mom did it to me. I was ready to give up and throw in the towel. And it's just this moment of like self-realization that the reality that he knew was not the true reality. The reality that he knew was that his dad was the one that had given everything for the marriage. But in reality, his dad was willing to quit and give up and wasn't the same man that he knew. And it took his realization in that to learn it. So often, we often cut our nose to spite our face, and instead of taking the hard time to work through these things together so that we can see our spouse as the person that they need to be. And oftentimes, and let me say this, I say that in a way that's not arrogant, that is not possessive or owning or demeaning to say, my spouse can't iron worth a flip and burns mac and cheese out of the box. I can see them as being the next Emerald and better than Fleming's Cleaners if they can get there. That's not what it's talking about, right? It's spiritually to be patient, to be someone that can be loving and kind, someone that can be content in the marriage, that can find peace and rest in Christ. Those attributes that we see as someone that is a believer in Jesus, that we can see in our spouse to say, I know we can get there together. I know we can do that together and be someone better. Which oftentimes, again, to use an athletic example, it would be like looking at a player, whatever sport you're coaching, and knowing that you can see it in them, right? That they're ready to go to that next step if they would just practice. To use a personal example for me, I had a coach. I always hit, in the low 40s, high 30s on the front nine and stuff in high school, our little local golf course. And the coach told me, he's like, Matt, if you would just spend time just chipping around the green, you could probably knock off a couple of strokes off your golf game. I'm like, yeah, coach, you're probably right, And we go out there to practice, and what do? I just go on a golf cart and I go play 9 holes. I wasn't practicing. I wasn't out there for that. I was out here because we got to play a free round of golf every day in February, March, and April for golf practice. And I didn't care about trying to do anything like that. My plan was to go to community college, period. I didn't have the grades to get into a 4-year school or anything along those lines. And so I didn't put in that effort. And he could see it. He's like, if you would just do it. And he would get so mad at me. I would just chip the ball right over the green and be there in 2, and then all of a sudden I'd finish with like a triple bogey because I couldn't get the ball on the green from 50 yards out. And my golf game has not improved at all in those years. I still haven't learned to practice chipping. But in a lot of times in the way that we look at sports and athletics, a lot of times players and teams have an MVP award, right? Most valuable player or the most improved player. And it's someone who has at one time been someone that was struggling, right? That needed improvement. And the coach doesn't say, hey, Jordan, you're useless. You're never going to become anything. But a good coach looks at them and says, you've got potential, you've got capabilities, you've got opportunities if you're willing to put in the work to do X, Y, Z. And in athletics, they use the frame buy-in, right? If the player buys into this, then they can often can grow in that way. But in marriage, it's oftentimes the same way. To be able to look and say, I know you can be better. I know you can do better. And we have to do that, right? We must stick with one another, and we have to know that we can see the better in our spouse. But with that comes great responsibility, because there again, there's the power of truth and love. And I love the example that Keller uses of the godly tantrum as a mix of the power of truth, because it does put us in a perspective, right, to where when we have the truth, we got to do something with it. And Keller tells about his time when he goes to plant Redeemer Church in New York City, in Manhattan. And planting a church itself is hard work, but I can only imagine planting a church in Manhattan, which would be insane. And to hear the numbers of folks in New York City, Philadelphia, large cities like that, of atheists, agnostics, language barriers, the whole 9 yards, I mean, it's just preposterous to what we know is a reality here in the Bible Belt. And he's right with his statistic that, you know, the first 3 or 4 years of planting a church is the hardest work. You're developing it, you're getting a space, you're getting a core group built up, and all of these things to try and get to a place to where you can be self-sufficient, really, as a church. And so he tells Kathy, he says, hey, you know, bear with me for these 3 years, and things will slow down. Right, here's the evidence. You've been in the meetings, you've heard this. This is what it has. 3 years comes and goes, and his workload, he never slows down. And she says, hey, it's been 3 years. Months go by, and the same thing. And he walks by his apartment, and he hears just crashing, the doors open. And he goes upstairs, and his wife is sitting with their wedding china in the floor of their apartment with a hammer, breaking plates. And she said, you won't listen to me? I have told you that you were going to tear this family apart if you don't start managing your workload, start delegating. I don't know how else to get your attention. And there she goes again, breaking another plate. And he just sits down and weeps and says, I'm listening. And he said, what I had realized is that the workload, I had come to love the productivity that I was having. And it wasn't about the workload that I had promised, but I had loved what I was doing beyond taking care of my marriage and my family. And she said, I'm so glad that you're listening because he said, you know, why are you being so calm and collective? Why aren't you yelling? You know, why aren't you? She said, because I'm not mad. I'm not mad. I love you, but you've got to listen to the truth. And thankfully, that over the years, these 3 saucers, the cups have been broken over the years. And thank God you walked in, because a 4th one, I would have had to break the cup too. And she said, you know, you just needed to listen. And sometimes we get to a point in marriage to where we think that we have to get to the point of throwing a tantrum to where folks will listen to us. And in those difficult positions, we have to understand that there is the power of truth. And then in the result of that, the power of love. And in the mix is often found that tantrum, right? It can be rational and intentional, but loudly and honest. But marriage